I will go ahead and tell you as we start, there's several things. My mind is in one of those moments where when you're studying and you're thinking through who God is, and you're seeking a way to be able to convey it with understanding, but also with the depth of the scriptures. There comes moments in time when even this morning I found myself at my desk and just push back and just find myself just really overwhelmed at who God is. I've almost made it through a whole semester without crying, and so I'm going to try to fulfill that today as well. But today we continue our study, our time together in chapel on the characteristics of God, and it has been our prayer that you've been encouraged. It's been our prayer that you've kind of been forced to think through some things that we know and some things that we perhaps haven't thought of. And a couple of warnings I would just give you is that after we get through the end of this series, that it's important for us to recognize that you really can't take one of the characteristics of God and isolate it from the other characteristics, because he is God. And so one of our challenges is to take all these pieces and fit them back together. The other challenge is certainly when we're talking about God, who really can understand the mind of God, who can understand the depths of what we are trying to put into words today. And so I come with that in mind. Today, I want to talk to you, I want to speak these few moments that we have about the self-sufficiency of God. This actually came about as we were walking through it, and I knew I was at the end, and I had watched as other faculty members had made decisions, and there came a question about, so what's left? And a friend, by the way, actually said, hey, why don't you think about this? And it began a journey over a couple of months of just exploring the simple truth that the God that we serve is self-sufficient. It's something we don't think about often. It's something that perhaps has never crossed your mind before. The word that defines this is the word aseity. Aseity is a Latin term which means from himself. It means that everything that God needs is found within himself. We do not serve a needy God, nor do we serve a God who is incomplete or who is lacking in any way. He is complete. He is self-sufficient. This is kind of the opposite of what we're being taught. We think that we are self-sufficient. As a matter of fact, much of our lives we spend trying to demonstrate that we really are independent and we can do it ourselves. And in case you're wondering, yes, there is a book called The Complete Idiot's Guide to Self-Sufficient Living. The reality is that we're not self-sufficient. We are dependent. As a matter of fact, we're dependent upon a lot of things, but most of all, we're dependent upon God for this life that we live and for the creation in which we live as well. But what's interesting is that even though we find ourselves dependent, God is not dependent. He has no needs. He has created this world, and he exists entirely without depending upon this world. He always has been, and he always will be. There are many passages I could refer you to. Let me point out two quick ones, and I would encourage you to go back and do your exegetical work and make sure that you see the context with all these. But Paul had found himself in the city of Athens, and he's walking around. He's waiting now for word back of what's happening in Thessalonica and what's happening in Berea. And he's waiting on Silas and Timothy to come. And as he's waiting, he's walking around the city, and he sees all these idols. And then he finds an idol to an unknown God. And Paul uses that as an opportunity then to spark a conversation, to talk to them about the only God. And here's what he says. In Acts chapter 17, verses 24 and 25, we recall Paul's words. He says this. He says, the God who made the world and everything in it, He is Lord of heaven and earth, and he does not live in shrines made by hands. Now listen to what he says. Neither is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives everyone life and breath and all things. You'll notice in this passage the phrase, as though he needed anything, implying that we know that God is not a needy God. He needs nothing, and he is not served by others, including you and me, and he is the source of life and breath himself. Another passage, just to reiterate this, is when Moses was preparing to speak for God, and he asked the question, familiar word. He said, God, who am I going to tell them sent me? Do you remember what God said? In Exodus chapter 3, verse 14, we read these words, and God spoke to Moses, and he said this, I am who I am. That is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am sent me to you. When he mentioned those words, what he says is this, is that God's existence is not dependent upon anybody else. God is one who is self-sufficient to himself. Paul states this as well in Romans 11. He says this, for from him, through him, and to him are all things. He is not a needy God. Now, let me remind you of a couple of things, okay? Here's the truth, y'all. We are needy people. We don't want to admit that. You know people who are needy. You may be one of those people, and there may be people looking at you right now smiling with that acknowledgement that you are that needy person in their lives. But the truth is, we do not want a needy God. Because if we have a needy God, then we suddenly find that God is using us to meet his needs, when in reality, he is a God who is pure in actions, pure in relationships, pure in motives, and the best that we have to offer for him does not fill up anything that he is lacking. As a matter of fact, the reality is simply this: God is self-sufficient with or without us. Now, sometimes we accidentally are not careful about things that we teach, and we almost teach that God needs us. And by the way, you don't need to listen to this whole statement. I was thinking of this as I was walking through this. This is actually kind of depressing until you hear the whole story. So just stay with me, okay? Don't check out yet. It's just going to be a short time, okay? But we say things like this when we talk about creation. A child will ask a Sunday school teacher, so why did God create us? And sometimes, without thinking, teachers will say something like this, well, God was lonely, and he needed relationships. Well, the reality is that God doesn't need relationships. Now, he desires relationships, but he doesn't need relationships. And the reason God created us and the reason he invited us into a relationship with him is not because he needs us, it's because he loves us. As a matter of fact, that sets us free because suddenly we recognize it's not a matter of what I do, it's not a matter of what I can accomplish. He just loves us because he is, after all, love. So with all that in mind, let me remind you of 4 very quick truths, and then I'll end with how this should change the way we respond. Here's the first truth. Because the God that we serve is self-sufficient, the first truth is simply this: God is the only independent being. He is the only person, the only being that exists, not dependent upon you or me or upon anything else. It does not matter what happens upon this earth. It doesn't matter what happens in our personal lives. He is still completely God. And whereas there are times in our lives where we find lackings, we find things that we need, and by the way, in a very unusual manner, we have the opportunity, even though he doesn't need anything, to go to him for our needs, and he is a God who does care. We'll see that in a second. When we go to him and he gives us out of his graciousness, it doesn't change the simple truth that the God that we serve is still independent, still fully God. It means that even as we've sung this morning, he can be our true foundation. No storm, no stock market, no disease, no anything will ever shake God or change God. He is independent of all these things, which means he is God and he will always be God. And listen, he was the same God 1,000 years ago as he will be 1,000 years from today. He is an independent, self-existing God that causes us to find strength and courage to say, this is the God that we serve. The second thing you find within this understanding of God being self-sufficient is a simple truth that not only is he the only independent being, he's also the source of all things. In Colossians chapter 1, Paul says this, for by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. All things were created through him and for him. And then notice what he says. He is before all things. That has to do with time, but it has even more so to do with preeminence. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. What that reminds us is our God is self-sufficient. He is not dependent upon us or upon anything else. Therefore, he is one that we can trust. He has created us, and he is a God who will sustain us in all of life. You walk through difficult times. The reality is you don't have to wonder, is God able? The truth is, he is able. You don't have to wonder about whether God is still on the throne. He is still upon the throne. You don't have to wonder about whether God is a God who is powerful and a God who can still do miracles and work in this world. The reality is he is still God. He has created us. He has sustained us. And by the way, long after we have left this life and we are moving into the very presence with him, he will continue to be God, still self-sufficient, still not needy, still God. The third thing he says is to remind us of this, and I do need you to hear this real carefully, okay? I've already told you this and may have hurt your feelings this morning. Probably in the first time I've hurt your feelings in my work here. But let me just tell you this. Though God doesn't need us, God does desire a relationship with us. As a matter of fact, as I started thinking about this, it's really changed or better yet, affirmed my understanding of my relationship with God. I've always been reminded that the best I have to offer God is really not much. And my relationship with him is not established based upon what he needs to be done in this world or what he needs me to do or what I have to offer. My relationship with God is established simply because he loves me. Today, you're in a relationship with God, not because he needs you to pastor a church or to be the minister to a group of youth or to teach a Bible study to senior adults or to lead a women's ministry. You're in a relationship with God simply because he loves you. He doesn't need you, but he loves you. And by the way, in case you're wondering, we find ourselves doing all these other things, not because he needs us, but because we love him as well, and we want to do that which pleases him. We want to do that which brings him honor. We want to do that which then shows others about the love that we've discovered, a love that is undeserved, and a love that comes from a Father that simply doesn't need us. I'm thankful that the God that we serve, even though he's self-sufficient, even though he is from himself, that he is a God who is very personal. He has, imagine this, y'all, he does not need us, but he has created us so that we need him. He has created every single person, and we've seen this in the world in which we live, so that without that relationship, without that finding God and finding the love that he has for us, a person on this earth will find themselves incomplete, and they'll find themselves lacking. that there is a hole and a hunger within them that can't be found or filled any other way. And even though God doesn't need us to be in a relationship with him, he has created us so that we find ourselves needing him. And when we come to him, we discover that he is a God who cares. Peter says you can cast all your cares upon him. Why? Because he cares for you. Real quickly, fourth thing is simply this. God's self-sufficiency really does impact our worship. I say this very, very careful, but I want you to hear my heart. We don't worship because God needs our worship. We worship because we discover who he is, and we want to give him back the worth that we have discovered within him. Our God is not needy where he is waiting for us to create services where we sing and we praise and we preach so that he can have his felt needs met. But instead, we're invited to worship because it gives us the opportunity to recognize, even as the song says to us, that there really is no one like you. We could search for all eternity and discover that there really is no God like the God that we serve. Self-sufficient, complete within himself. So our response, let me just throw these four things at you, and then we're going to pray and we're going to leave. Okay, so what does this mean? Here's what it means. Everybody with me? Here's what it means. First of all, let me remind you of this truth. Just keep walking humbly with God. Just keep walking humbly. Listen, don't ever think that God should be honored that you are his. Instead, we should be honored that he loves us enough to call us to be his. And in humility, we recognize we have nothing to offer because he needs nothing. Keep walking humbly. The second thing is keep trusting. Right now, some of you are in the throes of writing papers and dealing with the discovery that your syllabus really does say the paper is due tomorrow. And that was a new moment for you. All honesty, there's some of you here who are really walking through some very difficult times, medical issues. And some churches are chaotic at best. And here's what I want you to know. You can go to the self-sufficient God, the God who is complete in and of himself, and you can trust him. He cares about you. He loves you, and you can trust him. The third thing I would just tell you this is just keep living in awe of him. Let's make certain that we continue to discover, even as we talked about this semester, that he is a God who's self-sufficient. He's a God who doesn't change. He's a God full of compassion. He's a God of faithfulness, as we talked about on Tuesday, and all these characteristics. And let's make certain that even as we think about our God who is self-sufficient, who is complete in and of himself, yet allows us to know him at all, let's find ourselves in awe of who he is. Let's not ever let God become so customary to us that we don't find ourselves dumbfounded to be able to be in his presence. And then finally, I remind you of this. I give you a warning about worship, but let's do this. Let's keep worshiping. Let's keep worshiping him. Let's make sure our motives are right. Let's make sure our hearts are right. But every time God reveals himself to us, every time we understand afresh and anew who he is, use it as an opportunity to live in awe, but use it as an opportunity to lift your voice to God and say, God, there really is no one like you. And we worship you because no other person, no other being, nothing deserves worship like you. I have good news for you today. The God that we serve, the God that we know, is a God who is self-sufficient. Would you join me as we pray? With your heads bowed, listen to this. A.W. Pink wrote this. He said this: God is solitary in his majesty, unique in his excellency, peerless in his perfections. He sustains all, but is himself independent of all. He gives to all, but he is enriched by none. And Paul says this: now to the King eternal, immortal, invisible, the only God, to him be honor and glory forever and ever. Amen. Thank you. You're dismissed.